Hello, I'm Victor Yalom, and I'm pleased to be here today with Irvin Yalom, psychiatrist, psychotherapist, writer, and my father. Good to be here with you today.
Pleased to be here with you today, Victor.
So we've just celebrated your 85th birthday.
2 days ago.
2 days ago. And you've just finished writing your memoir, at least the first draft of that. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was an opportune time to sit down with you. Mm-hmm. You've reflected back on your life and your life's work in your memoir. And I'm a psychologist, and I've been a student of your work, so to speak, for my professional career, and learned a great deal from you. And you've certainly influenced a generation of psychotherapists with your writings and your teachings. And what I wanted to do in these conversations is really try to take a broad look at the lifetime of your work and your ideas, make some connections, and discuss them in a way that my hope will be very useful for current psychotherapists, students, and practitioners. So that's my goal, and I would encourage the viewers to both listen to the content of what we talk about, and as we do with clients, also listen kind of between the lines, because what impresses me as I think about the body of your work is how it's evolved, how you've really brought strands together from philosophy, from group therapy, which you really developed a very powerful and useful model, applied learnings from that to individual therapy. There are a lot of strands that I think are interesting to follow. And so I would encourage anyone viewing these videos to really listen between the lines. And as we talk about various topics, say group therapy, even if they're not practitioners of group therapy, maybe they'll consider it, but there's so much that I've learned and others have learned from doing group, for example, that apply to individual therapy. So I encourage people to kind of take a broad view of things. I'd like to kind of dive, go way back chronologically in your career. And in your memoir, you relate a very moving story. I think it was really your first case of psychotherapy. You were a third-year medical student. You had your training, undergraduate, had been purely in the sciences.
Right.
And then you were in medical school, taking the standard medical school curriculum, and you did a psychiatry rotation, and it was your first time to sit with a client. And as you related, you sat down, I think the first session, and the client said, you asked why she was coming in, and she said, I'm a lesbian. And your response to that?
My response to that, well, let me give you just a little background.
Okay.
Because I've been listening to other students who have been in the course longer than I, and about their 8th week there, they had to present to the body of therapists who were kind of directing and supervising them. It was a very, very august bunch. They were people from the Boston Psychoanalytic Society. I imagine there were probably 6 to 8 of them there, including the chairman of the department. His name was Malamud, I remember. A couple of analysts from the Boston Psychoanalytic, and they were dour, and they were very severe with the students. I thought they were quite cruel, really, without being much very supportive, and they were trying to outdo one another in their questions and criticisms of them.
В далекие-далекие времена жадные дворяне наживались на неграмотном народе. Хорошо, что у них был знакомый в Шервуде. И сейчас, спустя века, узнать, как пополнять свои кошельки, а не чужие, помогает sherwood.biz. Он может превратить тунеядца во фрилансера, любителя в настоящего профи. Помочь безыдейному стать гением. Хочешь привлечь клиентов в свое дело, научиться программированию или анимации, а может выучить чужеземные языки? Получить знания, чтобы заработать, тебе поможет sherwood.biz. Заходи, узнавай, учись.
И позвольте мне сказать вам кое-что еще. Нет стремления более естественного, чем стремление к знанию.
And this was the time when psychoanalysis had a heavy weight in psychiatry training.
Now, it's hard for anyone to believe, but most chairmen of psychiatry were psychoanalysts in those days.
Very different than now.
No, I don't think any chairman or psychoanalyst at this time.
Yeah.
I saw this patient. I was ready to present that patient, and I'd seen several medical students, one after the other, get kind of skewered for the errors they had made. So I just decided that I would present it somewhat differently, that I knew how to tell a story. I mean, I hadn't done any writing at that time, but I read a great deal of fiction and novels, and I'd always been able to tell stories in high school and junior high school, so it was my mode. I read a lot of stories in my life. So I just decided I wasn't going to give the formal presentation, which is patient's chief complaint, past history, history of this complaint, and social history, educational history. We had this rather strict program. I just decided I would tell it as a story. And I told them that I met this patient first time. It was a young woman, redheaded woman. I've forgotten her name right now. And she told me that she was a lesbian. I had never heard the word before. I had no idea what she was talking about. This isn't terribly unusual from that era.
Yeah.
So
what time frame are you talking about?
Oh, this was about 1955.
Mm-hmm.
I never met a gay person, and nobody I knew ever declared themselves. So it was a fairly unknown phenomenon at that point to the general public. So I just decided I might just well be honest with her and just said, well, I don't know what that means. Could you educate me? And so I think by just acknowledging my ignorance to her and letting her tell me about her life and learning as much as we could about it, and we formed a very good relationship. I'd seen her about 8 times at that point. We were doing quite well. So I told these therapists, these teachers who were watching, the story of my acknowledging my ignorance and how our relationship had grown and grown. It was doing very well at this point. I think she was getting some help out of that. So that was my first encounter. And when I finished that story, I tucked in my ears and kind of waited for the onslaught that always occurred, but it did not occur. The chairman of the department, after a little silence, said, well, I have nothing to add to this. It speaks for itself. And other people said more or less the same thing. There was zero criticism from any of the therapists at that table. When I finished that conference, it was a real turning point in my life, I felt. I just felt, maybe I've got something different, something that may be unique to bring to this field. So that was the story of my first encounter with psychiatry.
Yeah, and the reason I'm so nice to hear that in your own words, it just seems like that story is a microcosm of so much what followed later in your career. It makes me think of a number of things. One, your just being upfront with her and acknowledging you didn't know what that meant, and that you've That's one of the things you've been known for throughout your career, throughout your writing, is to be honest with clients, to be transparent, not to put yourself above them as an expert. And again, this was your first case. It didn't sound like that was a strategy you had going in. You had no strategy.
Right.
It just happened.
Right.
And yet you learned from that a very powerful lesson that
She was very non-defensive,
mhm,
taught me about her life.
right.
I learned a lot about her life of lesbians in those days.
So that seems like another lesson right there is learn from our clients.
Sure.
Be curious.
Sure.
And try to understand them. Try to learn about their life. Don't come in with a preconceived notion of what you're going to do with them. That seems very powerful. And then in terms of your ability to tell a story, which is what you've been doing for your career, is teaching largely through telling stories. So I think it's a beautiful example. And just one other thought I just had, I think it was Carl Rogers who said something along the lines, or at least I've heard it attributed to him, that great therapists are chosen, that it's more important to select great therapists in programs rather than training them.
Yeah, that it's attributed to Carl Rogers. He did say that. He said he thinks that therapists should be chosen rather than trained. In other words, that some people have a kind of almost inbuilt innate quality of empathy, and in some ways I find that to be somewhat true, not entirely true, but somewhat true. As I've met over many, the whole generation of therapists who start in their first year at Stanford and as going to be trained as a guy, I can select them. I know my first class, I got 12 students in front of me. I spent a few hours with. I know which ones are going to be good therapists and which ones are going to may end up being good therapists, but they have to work awfully hard. But some of them are quite natural, and I see it in my first days.
All right. Yeah. This is, of course, we don't want to be too negative about it. If you couldn't train therapists, if they couldn't learn, then we wouldn't
train all therapists, but some of them it takes more effort, more time.
Right. So continuing with that line of thought of the training of therapists, I think it would be useful to talk about your early training and who influenced you. I know after medical school you went off to Johns Hopkins.
Right.
And you had a few influential teachers there.
Yeah. I didn't get much training in psychiatry. I went to George Washington for my first year. Very hard to get into medical school. It's so hard to get into medical school. It was even harder to get into medical school then. And extremely hard to get into medical school if you were Jewish. There was a 5% restriction, a quota on being Jewish, and that was pretty explicit. We all knew that, and it was,
so the medical schools would only accept 5% Jews.
Only present 5% Jewish students, and almost no women, and almost no blacks. My medical school at George Washington had 2 women in it and 5 Jews. And it was 100 students. So just about the quota all around the country.
Yeah.
So it's very hard to get into medical school. Getting into medical school, those 3 years of college, they have a lot of envy of people who really have wonderful college memories and fraternities, and sometimes it was the best years of those. I never had that. I worked extremely hard, always under the pressure of getting A's. It was too much. I did an overkill. I didn't get A's. I got A pluses. But I felt I had to get such good grades that they had to take me.
Yeah.
And also I chose to get into medical school after only 3 years. You could do that, but generally the great majority of people went for 4 years and got a bachelor's degree. I didn't do that. I was so anxious about getting in. I was in such a hurry. Also, I had met this woman who I wanted to marry. So I just wanted to nail her before someone else did and get in a position where I could be a doctor and offer her something. So I was in a rush. And
that worked out, the marriage.
the marriage worked out. Medical school worked out.
My mother.
I would have had a better chance of getting to other medical schools if I had gone for 4 years. But had a straight A average. I think I had 1 B plus, all A's, applied to 17 medical schools, and I got into one.
Yeah.
And that was George Washington. They had to take me. How could they not take someone who was a straight A student from their own school?
Yeah.
So I went there. Had I taken another year, I might have had a larger choice. But I was pretty happy with GW. And then I decided I didn't have any psychiatry at GW in just the first year. It was totally anatomy and physiology, biochemistry. Then I transferred to Boston University for my second, third, and fourth years. That was solely to be with Marilyn, who was finishing up at Wellesley at that point. And as I say, my first psychiatry course was my third year. And there may have been a little rotation in my fourth year, but very little psychiatry in medical school. And then certainly not in my internship. I interned at Mount Sinai in New York. Very good internship, very hard rotating internship, which means you spend a couple months here, a couple months on surgery, a couple months, 3 months on medicine, a couple months on pediatrics, obstetrics. You rotate around, but there's no psychiatry clerkship there for students at that level of their training. I did hang out a lot with the psychiatry department, though, and engaged and helped. I was volunteered as subject for some of their research, including a research on LSD, which had just come out. So my first experience with LSD, which at that point was very exciting, and thought to have a lot of implications for psychiatry. Maybe some of our patients in some way had some excess of LSD in them because they thought the symptoms were somewhat similar to schizophrenia.
That was the thinking.
That was the thing. My first published paper was on LSD. It was as soon as I got to be a resident, I began to have a lot of contact with schizophrenic patients. I wrote an article trying to refute that notion. There was no similarity between the LSD experience, which I had some of as a subject to their research, and the phenomenology of schizophrenia.
So you went to Johns Hopkins to do your psychiatry training, and I know you had a few influential teachers there, John Whitehead and Jerome Frank.
Whitehorn.
Yeah,
that was a very good residency. I had a few choices of where to go, but I thought I wanted to go to Hopkins. It had a long, good reputation. It was a small residency, and it had a reputation of students having a lot of responsibility and autonomy in their work with patients. One, but secondly, large, easy access to a lot of high qualified supervisors. That was true for medicine and surgery and psychiatry. So I went to Hopkins, and I had there were two teachers that were very important to me. One was John Whitehorn. He was the chief of the department, a very standoffish, dour man, very intelligent. It was very anti-psychoanalytic. He was interested in the medical and human side of psychiatry. And in my third year, I spent a lot of time with him. We spent one Fridays, all day Fridays, we spent with John Whitehorn. We rounded with him, which means he had a certain number of patients in the hospital. So he interviewed them on Fridays, and we sat in on the interviews and discussed each patient after the interviews. His interviews went on sometimes 15 minutes, sometimes 3 hours. You never did know quite what was going to happen.
you described some of that in your memoir, and I've heard you talk about him.
Yeah.
It sounded like that he really entered the client's world just as you did with your first case.
In a somewhat different way. He wanted to find out a great deal about the client's life and occupation. If he was a coffee grower in South America, he would go on for hours talking about letting the patient teach him about how to plant coffee trees and what the influence of altitude was, the altitude that the tree was planted on, and the quality of coffee. And we knew a lot more about coffee than I ever wanted to know. But by the end of a couple hours, this very paranoid patient was starting to talk in very sensible ways and relating openly. And he always used to say, let the patient teach you. Let the patient teach you about what they know, and you'll become a very fast ally of the patient. That was his way of doing it. Nobody else I've ever heard of ever interviewed like that. But I took note of it. I mean, he really got results with that.
What did you learn from that?
Well, I learned how to deal with the patient's anger. I learned that if people are very suspicious, not to go plunging into the suspiciousness right away, but form a very good alliance with the patient first.
And of course, the research has borne that out. That's probably the most powerful predictor of therapeutic outcomes,
Right.
forming a strong alliance.
Right. He did it in this very unusual way. No one else will ever do that. No one else is going to have 3-hour interviews with patients talking about another patient with Spanish Armada. He did his PhD in that. And I learned a lot about the Spanish Armada during one morning with John Whitehorn. He was a collector of information. And we had long lunches with him every Friday. They were Southern elegans, brought in crab cakes. And we just had the opportunity to talk with him for hours. So he was a very important figure to me, and ended up being very important in my life. He counseled me at the end of the residency, that asked me what I was going to do afterwards. I really didn't know at that point. He told me, I think his words were, I know his words were, that it would fly in the face of fortune for me to do anything but academic career.
And he said that because?
He said that because at that point I was a little unusual among residents, and I had already written several articles. I wrote easily, and when something interesting came my way, that I think I could make some observations, and I used that. I had a rotation in Hopkins in a facility in which people who had committed sexual crimes were hospitalized. It was called an indeterminate sentence. In other words, they were sentenced to stay in this hospital prison for as long as it took for them to show levels of improvement.
Yeah.
Naturally, there was a lot of conning on the part of the prisoners and thing, but I was one of the therapists. I spent a rotation, I think 2 or 3 months at this hospital. So I saw interesting things. I wrote it up for psychiatric journals, and journals accepted. I had an ability to write. And so I think the first article, the LSD, came maybe just after this. I started to work with voyeurs. People have been hospitalized for voyeurism. Sounds strange, but these were people who were really making pests of themselves and were looking into women's bedrooms and residential neighborhoods, and police catch them. And so I started to work with voyeurs, and wrote an article about that. I tried to puncture the common myth that voyeurs were really quite harmless group of people, because in fact many of these people had gone on from voyeurism to breaking and entering and into rape. So it wasn't only a very harmless crime. So I think the title of that article was Aggressiveness, Voyeurism, Aggressiveness, and Forbiddenness. Forbiddenness means that voyeurs don't go to nude shows. They don't go to porno. They get their thrill out of watching someone whom they're not supposed to be watching. So anyway, John Whitehorn urged me to go into academic psychiatry. And later, many years later, 15 years later, the chairman of Stanford showed me the letter that he had written to him, really got me my first position at Stanford. So these ways he was instrumental in my career.
Yeah, and the letter seemed quite predictive, I recall.
The letter said that he thought that I would be a leader of American psychiatry. So what chairman couldn't hire someone like that? You had to. So he really helped me.
Yeah.
He did not have many human relationships. He was very distant. So in that way, he was not an entirely well-rounded psychiatrist. So I was very shocked when about probably 5 to 10 years after I started at Stanford, I got a call from his daughter saying that her father had a serious stroke and was asking to see me before he died. So I flew out to Baltimore and spent a couple hours with him in his room. He couldn't talk. He had a very severe stroke. He was in terrible shape and very, very scared. He kept saying to me, I couldn't do very much at that point to help him, but I was with him at his bedside when he died.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.